Imagine you're trekking through the Vietnam jungles on another mission with a couple of other American soldiers. You're moving cautiously, keeping an eye on the ground and listening to the jungle sounds. Suddenly, you hear rustling behind you. You stop breathing for a moment, and all you can hear is your own heart pounding. Your only hope right now is that these are Viet Cong soldiers. Strangely enough, armed enemy soldiers were the safest thing you could encounter in the jungle. You and your colleagues knew very well what really killed American soldiers in Vietnam. Americans feared the jungles because they were filled with a variety of traps. They could stumble upon a bow like this on a tripwire. One type of these fired horizontally into a soldier's torso. The Viet Cong also set up vertical bows in pits. These shot upwards, targeting the lower extremities. Another type of booby trap hanging from a tripwire swung down from above. It was a dreadful heavy mace fitted with long spikes. If you were unlucky enough to trigger one of these, it would literally decapitate you, or at the very least, strike you in the heart. That's why keeping your eyes on the ground was a matter of life and death. But even under regular leaves, severe injuries awaited. One careless step and a soldier would find himself in a punji trap hidden beneath a layer of leaves. Viet Cong soldiers would embed sharpened bamboo sticks in the pit. Not too long, though, to avoid killing an enemy soldier instantly. Marine Private Frank Harbert was one of many who fell victim to a punji trap. He felt a sharp pain in his leg, and the next thing he remembered was how he was screaming in agony on the ground. The trap's structure resembled a snare, making it impossible to just pull his leg out. A soldier could suffer a much worse injury. It took more than an hour to free one injured soldier from such a trap. After that, they had to transport him to a medical station. So even though the trap didn't kill soldiers immediately, it incapacitated several at once. This constant threat of getting maimed weighed heavily on the soldiers, demoralizing them. Just imagine half of your unit wiped out by these darn traps. You're furious, wanting to avenge those who've screamed in pain. And just then, an order arrives to take a village. On the morning of March 16, 1968, 3 platoons of the American Army entered the village of Son Mai, where they expected to engage in combat with a large Viet Cong battalion of guerrillas. The Americans anticipated that the village would be booby-trapped, with danger lurking around every corner. However, instead of traps, they found only unarmed local elderly folks and children who offered no resistance. To avenge their fallen comrades, soldiers started shooting the locals, and there was no stopping them. Soldiers even killed livestock, cows, pigs, chickens, and ducks. They approached the local houses and ordered the people inside to come out. If no one came out, they threw a grenade into the house. In just 4 hours, the military killed at least 300 innocent civilians, none of whom were of conscription age. The slaughter only ended when a reconnaissance team and an observation helicopter spotted the corpses and burning huts. After a brief confrontation, the scouts convinced their colleagues to stop the killings and return to base. There was an attempt to conceal this war crime, but it still gained notoriety nonetheless, and those responsible were convicted, including for crimes against humanity. However, the sentences for this proved to be rather lenient. For instance, one lieutenant was sentenced to only 3 years of house arrest. It looks like another cunning trap by the Viet Cong generals to demoralize the enemy and make them commit atrocities, thus requiring even more soldiers to be tried in military tribunals. And these were far from the only prohibited tactics in the Viet Cong's arsenal. Yet the two sides in that war were in completely different situations. Imagine being a trained U.S. Army soldier for months, armed with the latest weaponry like the M16 rifle, Mark II grenades, and the brand new Smith & Wesson M76 submachine gun. You're covered by snipers with M40 rifles, heavy tanks like the Sheridan and the M60, and the Thunder Chief fighter bomber, armed with missiles and a swiveling cannon, always ready for bombing runs. Viet Cong soldiers had Kalashnikov rifles, F1 grenades, and homemade explosives in their arsenal. Heavy equipment was of Soviet and Chinese origin, significantly lagging behind the American counterpart. They faced significant difficulties in ammunition supply, but the Viet Cong managed to confiscate American weapons and collect scattered unexploded shells, using the gunpowder for their own purposes. In just 1 year, they managed to collect about 20,000 tons of unexploded shells. It seems incredible that with such differences, the Viet Cong managed to hold their defense for years and terrorized the heavily armed Americans. They gained the upper hand mainly through ingenious traps, and punji sticks were just the beginning. South Vietnamese soldier Lieutenant Tran Van Tuan has remembered for his entire life how his comrade lost his balance and simply disappeared after a careless step. So it all comes down to the fact that the Viet Cong planted tiger pits near their trails. These traps were camouflaged from above, and the moment a soldier stepped on one, he would lose his balance and slide down onto sharp bamboo sticks that pierced right through him. There was absolutely nothing anyone could do to save the poor soul. A less painful but much more drawn-out death awaited those who somehow got separated from their group and fell into one of these net traps. They were also cleverly concealed on the ground. One careless step and you'd find yourself hanging high in the air, totally defenseless and vulnerable to the enemy's mercy. The only way to survive was if your comrades spotted you in time. Otherwise, it was either capture or a slow death. One of the Viet Cong's greatest advantages was their in-depth knowledge of the terrain. Primitive, perhaps, but the strategically placed traps turned out to be more effective than conventional weapons. Ironically, the Americans were more afraid of these traps than the Viet Cong themselves, because most of the Viet Cong were just ordinary farmers with sporadic military training. Furthermore, despite their advanced weaponry and training, American soldiers often lacked clear military objectives. On top of everything, the subtropical climate with heavy rains severely impacted their combat effectiveness. The very nature of Vietnam itself was a trap. American soldiers constantly had to push through jungles, swamps, and rice fields teeming with malaria-infested mosquitoes, ticks, leeches, fire ants, and poisonous snakes. All of these factors forced the Americans to resort to desperate measures. In January of 1962, Operation Ranch Hand began, and it lasted until 1971. Over the years, within the operation, they sprayed chemical agents over the jungles of Vietnam, meant to kill off the jungle's vegetation. Unfortunately, it was toxic to humans too. More than 3 million Vietnamese people were directly affected, and the consequences have impacted the health of many future generations. In South Vietnam, mangrove forests covering 5 million acres were completely destroyed, and 60% of the jungle was affected. American forces destroyed over half of the banana, rice, and potato crops. But even these scorched earth tactics couldn't break the spirit of the Viet Cong or give the Americans a quick victory. It only forced the enemy to get even more devilishly creative. Since the Viet Cong were doomed in open combat, they had no choice but to develop an entirely new strategy. You finally made it through the impenetrable jungles without falling into the Viet Cong's traps and reached a village not far from Ho Chi Minh City, better known as Saigon. Everything seems calm. there's no sign of locals. Maybe this place has already been cleared. You decide to enter one of the houses, but that was a big mistake. You've fallen into a door trap. Above the doors of Viet Cong's houses, they'd hang T-shaped bamboo sticks with countless sharp spikes. At the upper end, there was a counterweight, much like a mousetrap mechanism. This mechanism was connected to a tripwire, and the first person to touch it would be caught by the spikes, which spread apart due to the force of gravity. But even if there weren't any door traps, it was still too early to relax. When retreating, the Viet Cong often left behind food and water. Due to hunger and thirst, American soldiers sometimes forgot about the enemy's cunning. In the late 60s, there were several incidents where American soldiers consumed rice and got poisoned. The Viet Cong used poisoned food and water to intimidate, in particular, their fellow defectors. For this, they used toxins from various creatures that could make every bite or sip a death sentence for the traitors and their families. In this context, a soda can appeared normal because it was securely sealed, but it was just an illusion. Inside, it was common to find a grenade rigged with one end tied to a string and the other to a pin. They'd hide the grenade inside the can. And it didn't matter what a soldier did, whether he picked it up hoping for a drink or gave it a swift kick. But where exactly were the Viet Cong retreating to from these trapped villages? 32 kilometers from Ho Chi Minh City, one structure played a pivotal role in the Viet Cong's guerrilla war. Deep below ground, the Coochi tunnels, essentially an underground fortress, stretched out. Rooms were excavated into the ground on multiple levels, connected by long, narrow tunnels. Their walls were incredibly sturdy, made of clay. To prevent flooding, they dug deep wells to channel rainwater. Various floors housed hospitals, kitchens, storerooms, dorms, and even a print shop. Partisans stockpiled enough food and water to last a month, allowing them to hide from bombardments. But it wasn't a comfortable life. Despite a ventilation system, it was still sweltering inside the tunnels. In the makeshift hospital, they performed surgeries without anesthesia, using the most basic tools. It's hard to even imagine the stench in there. Moreover, they sterilized surgical instruments in pans, perhaps the same ones they used for cooking. Lighting was dim, powered by hand generators. And right here, they set up classrooms for the children who assisted their parents in the guerrilla war. The deceased were buried right there, curled up in a fetal position in wall niches, sealed with a layer of clay. In the tunnels, they could not only hide from the enemy, but also mount a defense. The Americans were frustrated that they couldn't smoke the Viet Cong out of the tunnels. Due to their complex structure and considerable length, air raids could only destroy parts of the passages, and the Vietnamese quickly dug detours. When the Americans sent dogs into the tunnels, they'd return wounded, if they returned at all. So, the U.S. Army created a special team of fighters to infiltrate the tunnels and eliminate the enemy inside. For the Tunnel Rat Squad, they selected the most flexible and slender soldiers, no taller than 165 centimeters, because the passages were incredibly narrow, sometimes no more than 60 centimeters in width. And claustrophobia was the least of the worries for the tunnel rats underground. Before their first descent, these soldiers spent at least 3 months learning to detect and disarm various traps. They worked in pairs. The first would go underground and relay his route to his partner via radio, who would then sketch a map of the underground. Sometimes a whole group would descend, but they would stay several meters apart from each other, so that if one triggered a trap, the others wouldn't be affected. Death lurked at almost every step and turn. Most often, the Viet Cong rigged the tunnels with pit traps, the bottoms of which were again covered in sharpened bamboo sticks. To make the victims suffer more, they often smeared these sticks with poison. Inside the tunnels, you could also frequently encounter venomous creatures, mostly snakes. The Vietnamese had grown up dealing with them, so they easily caught them and turned them into weapons. For instance, they'd tie a snake to bamboo sticks and set it up in such a way that any stranger was bound to touch it. The snake would then bite the soldier's face or neck, causing near instant death. But that was just the beginning. Viet Cong soldiers placed boxes in the tunnels filled with scorpions, centipedes, fire ants, spiders, and even hornets, with wires attached to the boxes. If a soldier tripped this wire, the entire contents of the box would literally spill onto his head, subjecting him to dozens of painful insect bites. However, the protracted military conflict, with enormous losses on both sides, forced the Viet Cong to devise even more sadistic traps. You're lucky to have avoided falling into the clutches of the tunnel rats, so you think you'll steer clear of the most painful traps, but not so fast. You don't even think that you might very soon lose a limb. In 1965, 70% of Marine Corps casualties in Vietnam were due to traps employing explosives. One of the most primitive yet effective traps were ones employing grenades. These were placed near streams with tripwires drawn across the water. This ensured that a soldier would snag a wire connected to the grenade's pin, setting it off. What made this trap especially brutal was that anyone following behind the soldier would also get wounded. Another deviously simple yet incredibly painful trap consisted of a bullet inserted into a bamboo stick set in a hole that was nearly impossible to see. At the bottom, there was a board with a nail driven into it. When a soldier stepped on the trap, it would clamp shut and a cartridge would fire from the bamboo into their foot. But the most popular ones were bear traps scattered throughout the forest. Their greatest danger was that if a victim stepped into one, they would inevitably step into other hidden traps nearby and suffer not only a severe leg injury, but possibly damage to vital organs as well. But that was nothing compared to the mine that would chase you. The Bouncing Betty is a modification of a German anti-personnel mine used in open areas. The detonator of the Bouncing Betty is triggered by footsteps, causing the mine to jump out of the ground to a height of about a meter and then explode. It can kill several soldiers nearby and injure many more with high-speed shrapnel. One soldier, Leonard Thompson, mentioned how demoralizing it was. According to him, every step could be your last due to the traps and mines. But the absolute horror began when the Viet Cong discovered American camps at night. They used to sneak poisonous snakes and scorpions into the soldiers' backpacks and sleeping bags, so even at night, the soldiers couldn't relax. Marine John Harker recalls being bitten by a snake in Vietnam. He felt intense pain in his arm. Within minutes, his arm had become completely numb, and he could barely move it. Harker's comrades quickly applied a tourniquet and called a medical helicopter, so he survived. If it weren't for that rescue, Harker would have spent the next few hours dying in agony from the effects of the venom. What could be worse? The Viet Cong were determined to create and enhance traps. This led to the invention of the large punji trap, which ensnared victims up to their waist. The long, sharpened bamboo sticks inflicted injuries up to the groin, often damaging critical organs. But even that wasn't the worst. Sometimes the sticks were smeared with poison, rotting flesh, or even excrement. A soldier who fell into such a trap needed to be evacuated as quickly as possible, as infections from these devious wounds were extremely dangerous. Within the first day after infection, septic shock developed, which could only be treated with massive doses of antibiotics. But even with that, the afflicted's temperature would soar up to a whopping 40 degrees. Then came tachycardia and a blood pressure drop. Without nourishment, the tissues of internal organs began to die. If soldiers weren't treated during the first 3 days, they were doomed. In total, during the war, more than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives and over 300,000 suffered injuries. The exact number of casualties due to traps is unknown, but some researchers estimate that they may have caused up to a third of total losses. According to a Department of Surgery report from 1967, punji traps alone rendered 324 American soldiers non-combat ready, each for an average of 3 days. I wonder if the course of the Vietnam War would have changed if American scientists had taken the initiative to invent their own traps and started fighting back. Back in the early 19th century, German confectioner Theodor Kaiser invented a fly trap, experimenting with various glue variations. If American troops had picked up on this idea, they could have potentially scaled it up to create a massive sticky trap for humans. Imagine the Viet Cong trying to set up their traps and getting themselves into a sticky situation. And if the glue is just the right concoction, escaping would be next to impossible until American soldiers arrived. What do you think of the idea? And write in the comments which Vietnamese traps struck you as the sneakiest.